I was in a meeting 2 weeks ago, and or I guess that was all of last week, and so it's been a while since we've been in this class setting, at least since I have. What I want to do is we're going to talk about, after the Reformation, the spread of denominationalism. And I'm gonna take a little bit of a directed approach tonight, and I hope that it's effective. If you have other questions, I'm happy to talk about these things for as long as it's profitable for us to have these conversations. We have spent, the last almost 2 months now looking at the history of what has gone under the name Christianity, of church history from right after the close of the New Testament all the way up till about the publication of the King James Bible, right? That's kind of where we are, to the Reformation. And so I want to talk about some things as they've changed since 1500. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus our story a lot more on how it's developed in the United States. Of course, there's a lot more conversations to have about the development of religious history around the world, and that doesn't mean they won't have anything to factor in, but that's kind of how we're going to narrow our attention as we go. So this, let me see if I can make this work. I want to show you, let's see here. Does that work? Yeah. You may not be able to see this very clearly. That's okay, because I just want you to kind of see some of the broad outlines here. This is a map of Europe and with its religious divisions in the 1500s, the 16th century. This would be basically after what we would think of as the beginning of the Reformation. So think 1530s, 1540s. Now, it's difficult for us to think about. I'm going to show you a similar map in just a second. It's difficult for us to think about being able to identify such large swaths of territory as one religious group, right? So all of the yellow on that map is Roman Catholicism. All of the brown, especially towards the east, is Eastern Orthodoxy. The green in North Africa and towards the Middle East is Islam. But then you'll notice up here in the northern portions of Europe, I can't think this clicker works. It's kind of showing up briefly. Maybe a low battery. I don't know. You can see the red area, basically, that is all of England, is the Church of England, or Anglicanism. We'll talk briefly about that in just a moment. In northern Germany, you have the purple, which represents Lutheranism. And then you have the bluish colors, which represent Calvinism, or sometimes called Reformed churches. And let me suggest, you can see some places where there's kind of like hash marks right there. That would be places where there's a mix. Like in Western France, there were a lot of Calvinists. They were called Huguenots, French Huguenots. It's difficult, I think, for us to think about just being able to paint an area one color and being like, all these people are Roman Catholic, or all of these people are Lutheran. And the reality is not everybody within those territories was Catholic or Lutheran or Anglican or whatever. But the vast majority were, because it was during an age of state-imposed religion. It was during an era where basically whatever the leader of that area was, that would be imposed on the people. Of course, in all of these areas, like the very fact that we had a Reformation at all meant that there were people on the ground who were disagreeing with the people up on top. And so that means is that there was a lot of division even within these maybe solid colored areas. But just think about this just as a general idea. Also, like Anabaptists, the ancestors of what looked like our Mennonites and Amish look like. But what's interesting is like if you took an Amish person or a Mennonite person and put them in 1550, they'd fit right in. You know what I mean? So it's not as if that was out of sorts. They were out of sorts in their time. There's a great chapter in this little book by Daniel Petty, who was a professor at FC. He wrote a book about the Anabaptists as a restoration movement. I think we would disagree with a lot of the conclusions that they came to. But you're seeing in the 1500s not just efforts to fix a few things with the Catholic Church, but there were some people who were really committed to reading the New Testament and being what they were. And there were some ways in which the Anabaptists took that maybe we should pay attention to. And so all of that is to say is it's not as if the idea of restoration or replanting the gospel, it's not as if that was a new idea that just showed up in Pennsylvania in 1800 or something like that. It's an old idea. So those people are sprinkled throughout. But what I want to say here is, if you think about Europe in 1550, and in general, a person is going to be a Catholic, a Lutheran, an Anglican, a Calvinist. Anglican and Calvinism went very similar together. Maybe an Orthodox believer. That's only 5 different groupings, right? I think if you drove down 22 from one end to the other, you would see signs for 5 different groupings, right? And that's just right here. So what I want to think about is a little bit of how do we go from this to what would there be now? 20,000 different denominations. And like, we're going to talk some about Baptists tonight. You just think about all the different kind of Baptists that there are. There's particular Baptists, there's Free Will Baptists, there's Seventh-day Baptists, there's Primitive Baptists, there's, did I say Free Will Baptists? There's Southern Baptists, there's National Baptists. It goes on and on. And that's true for almost all of our religious groups, that there's variations within that. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit, and I'll explain how I want to approach that. This is a map of the United States. This is from a religious data census in 2020. So the religious data census is not a government-run thing. They used to do a religious census, and as an American historian, I loved the American religious census. It was very helpful, and when they stopped doing that, you lose a lot of data, but there are enough organizations now running polls and things like that that you can find this information. You know where we are on the map, and you can see that red color. That shows the dominant religion of our area. Anybody want to guess what that red represents? Baptist. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, of course, the dominance of the red doesn't mean that there aren't other churches there. The yellow, can you see the sprinklings of yellow through the map? Those are churches of Christ. So that would include institutional, non-institutional, one cup, very liberal, very strict conservative. They're not making distinctions in that identification. So, of course, we take any chart like this with a grain of salt, but there are things that are helpful to it. The purple is Catholic, so you can see the dominance in the Southwest and in the Northeast. The Northeast would be Irish Catholics for the most part. The Southwest would be Hispanic Catholics. And all the blue in the upper Midwest, that would be Lutheran. In fact, within an hour, I think I only know of one Lutheran church that I could drive to, and it's the one in Muscle Shoals right when you pass Taco Bell and McDonald's and all that. That's the only one I can. I guess there would be one in Florence. There's one. Yes, there is one. It's right off of Darby Drive, I think. But anyway, besides that, 2 within an hour that I could go to. But I'm going to show you some numbers about Franklin County in just a second. The reason I show you this is because I'm not going to take the time to focus on the development of every denomination that's out there, because we would never stop. I'm going to focus in on the ones we are most familiar with in our area. Not because the other developments are not significant, and we will mention them along the way, but because the greatest value, I think, of this class is trying to understand the roots of our religious neighbors and why they approach things in the way they do. But also, let me say this. You may have a friend or a neighbor who is a member of a particular denominational group who doesn't believe one thing that denomination believes, right? When I was growing up, we talked all the times about creeds and catechisms. And I think if you talk to somebody in a church, they would say, what's a creed? Right? I don't know that they would always know. Those are significant. They are helpful. But a lot, like, we live in an age now where it's a lot of like, this is my feeling about the subject rather than my denomination's teaching. We'll talk about that. We'll really come to that in the 20th century, and we'll talk about that then. So what I want you to see is that basically the South, you can see a few green areas show up. Those are areas where Methodists are dominant. And as far as like in Franklin County, in fact, this is the chart. I'll explain what all of this means. There is on the 2020 religious data, and you can just Google this, and you can look at any county in the country and find this information. This is as of 2020. So the numbers would be a little bit different. Like even for Churches of Christ, I know that the number would be a little lower now in numbers of congregations, at least as far as I know. But like in 2020, there were 36 Southern Baptist churches, which had 10,500 members approximately. Churches of Christ, a little over 2,000. Non-denominational, six congregations, or 1,000. I grouped three different kinds of Methodists together. You have the United Methodists, which as of 2020, still a thing. Now there's United Methodists and Global Methodists, and they have not done an updated version of this. Most of the churches in Franklin County that were United Methodist became Global Methodist. I think that's probably true of all of them. I may be wrong about that. Church of the Nazarene is a Methodist offshoot. Then the CME is African American. It does not stand for Colored Methodist Episcopal like I thought. I think it stands for Christian Methodist Episcopal, but it's CME. And then Presbyterian, there's two. There's a liberal Presbyterian and a conservative Presbyterian. And based on that chart, there were 25 Presbyterians in Franklin County. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Presbyterianism, but if you know those people, then it'd be worth talking about. The Pentecostal churches was a lot harder to get a number on. Mostly because we have a lot in Spanish that it didn't seem like the religious data was taking account of. And then the Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Catholic churches. There's one Mormon church in Franklin County. There's about 230 members. Jehovah's Witness, there are about 512 members in two congregations. And then the Catholic Church, about 2,000. And if you ever drive by there on an Ash Wednesday, you will believe that all 2,000 were there that day, because it is wild to think about. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on in Franklin County as of 2020. I know we're removed from that, but we'll have to wait for 2030 to get a new updated distribution of this. So if you look at that chart, if I'm going to focus on denominations, I think there are two that I want to talk about, and that is going to be the Baptist and the Methodist. Let me go back to where I was starting. All right. So that's the reason I'm going to focus on Baptist and Methodist tonight with denominational growth. Now, let me say this. As I have this discussion tonight, part of my aim will be to answer some things about Baptist and Methodist. But my primary purpose is to put them into their historical context and to try to understand them. We have a lot of people that we know and love who are Baptist and Methodist, don't we? Right? My grandparents were tried and true Baptists, and I think they would have defended the Baptist identity. In fact, they did all the way. It wasn't just I'm a Christian. It was I'm a Baptist, right? That meant something to them. And so I don't want to say any of this in a way that paints in an off-color way. I don't want to say any of it in a disparaging way or anything like that. I want to see what was happening and why the Baptist and the Methodist churches developed. Then we can talk about how they've been shaped through the last 400 years, 500 years. And of course, there are places where we seriously disagree. And in those places, it's really significant that we know how to have conversations with people who have these disagreements. And I'll say this, I would love to spend time, I would love to have a whole quarter studying Islam, maybe a whole quarter studying Buddhism or something like that. We're not running into those folks, right? But we're running into lots of people who are Baptist or Methodist. And so I want to be able to understand them. One of my favorite things about studying history is I can read from a Baptist 200 years ago, and my aim is to understand exactly what he's saying. And if I understand him as clearly as possible, I would like to be able to repeat his view to him, and he would say, amen. Because two things are going to happen. One of two things. Either I will be convinced because I understand him so well, or I will be in a better position to answer him from the scriptures, right? So I never want to be satisfied with just a shallow understanding of anybody's belief. So if I'm going to have a conversation with somebody, whether they're Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Islamic, or Buddhist, I want to understand what they're saying so that I can respond in an appropriate way. Because we're seeking for truth. We want to test all things. We want to prove all things. We want to hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil. So we want to understand. So let me just kind of describe what's going on in England through the 1500s. In the 1530s, late 1520s, early 1530s, Henry VIII is King of England. And Henry VIII is a devout Catholic. Now, it's interesting to think about that he would be a devout Catholic. In fact, he had written pamphlets, booklets, opposing Martin Luther and the Reformation. He was strongly opposed to the Reformation. But he's married to a woman, Catherine of Aragon, who is not bringing him a son. And he pushes for an annulment of his marriage. He writes to the Pope and asks for a marriage annulment because he wants to remarry. What's the line about Henry VIII? He's like, beheaded, died, beheaded, survived, or something. It's like he went through several wives, and he wants an annulment so that he can marry again because he wants to have a son. Right? He's not aware that this is on him that decides whether or not it's going to be a son. He thinks it's on the wife, and it is not. Okay. So he writes to the Pope, wants an annulment. The Pope says no, not because he doesn't have the power to do so, but because he is under house arrest and the control of Charles V, King of Spain. Charles V, King of Spain, was Catherine's nephew. So Charles, who is basically in authority over the Pope at this moment, doesn't want the Pope to grant that annulment. So what happens is Henry VIII says, okay, you don't want to grant me the annulment. He establishes a guy named Thomas Cranmer as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they establish not the Roman Catholic Church, but the Church of England. And the king, rather than just being the head of the English nation, is now the head of the English church as well. Now, we can talk more about the details, but what happens is Henry VIII establishes the Church of England. And all of that Catholic property and the hierarchy and all that is centered in an English setting. But he is not for Reformation theology. He wants the Church of England basically to remain Catholic. It's just with him at the head instead of the Pope, right? So what happens is that the Church of England goes through a period of several phases. When Henry VIII dies, he does have a son. His name is Edward, but he is very young and he is very sickly. And while he is in power, a group of people who really are for Reformationist theology use that period of time to really try to influence the doctrines of the Church of England, write special confessions and creeds and things like that. Well, then Edward, he's young and sickly, and he dies, and his sister, Mary, takes over. Now, Mary was Catherine's daughter. She was a Catholic. And we have the phrase Bloody Mary, not because of the drink that none of you participate in, right? But because Mary was so hostilely Catholic that she tried to take the whole Church of England back to Roman Catholicism and killed people who stood in her way. Well, then she dies. She's actually removed from office. And her sister, her name was Catherine, takes over. And Elizabeth takes over. And Elizabeth tries to bring about basically a compromise, a reconciliation, which becomes known as Anglicanism. So Anglicanism is like, we're going to keep the high church style of the Catholic Church and a lot of the theology of the Reformation churches, and we're going to try to bridge that gap and make Anglicans. Okay? Now, within the church, within England, everybody, by definition as a citizen of England, is a member of the Church of England, at least in their framing of it. Within the Church of England, there is a smaller group of people who are called Puritans. They believe that the church is way too Catholic still, but they think they can work within the structure of the Church of England to purify it. That's why they were called Puritans. But there was a group of people who believed that the Church of England was too far gone and that it could not be fixed from the inside, so they needed to separate. And the separatists broke off and established their own congregations. Now, the people that we know as the Pilgrims, they were separatists, right? That group had moved to Holland for a while, didn't like the liberal conditions of Holland, so they said, we can go to America. When they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, they did so with the idea of, we're going to go over here, we're going to build these communities because we don't want the influence of England, we don't want the influence of Holland, we want to establish this community in the wilderness. But most of those who settled in New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, all of these places, most of them were Puritans, not separatists. Now you say, why would you sail across the Atlantic Ocean and establish a colony in the middle of the woods if you want to purify the Church of England thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean? Well, their idea was that they would go, and you can read the speeches. It's a powerful speech. You can read the idea that they were going to come to the Americas. They were going to establish what they called a city on a hill. They were going to create a society based on Puritan, Reformed, Calvinistic principles that ran so well that the English would say, how are y'all doing that? And they would say, let me tell you about Puritanism. And they would carry that message. The problem is when they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, the English completely forgot about them and did not care until like 1754 when they want to take control. All right, so that does not accomplish what the Puritans want. But it certainly does create, it's hard for us to imagine, isn't it, that in the beginning of the United States as it would become, it was New England that was the most devotedly religious place, right? That's like that Harvard and Yale and like all these colleges were established to train preachers, right? Not to train whatever they train, all right? So that's what's happening in England, all right? Now, within all of that, you have people who are Puritans or Puritan-like who are pushing for transformation within the Church of England. So the first one I want to talk about is the Baptists. Now, the Baptists, there's different stories about their origins. Most historians agree that basically the origin of the Baptist was sometime between 1607 and 1609, John Smith and Thomas Helwise. And what they were pushing for is they were pushing for adult believers' immersion. Now, that's pretty significant, right? Because we're hearing some things and you're like, well, that's what I believe is adult believers' immersion. That's right. Now, they were doing that in response to what is called paedo-baptism. Paedo-baptism is infant baptism. Paedo, like pediatrician, pedo-baptism, right? That idea of paedo-baptism is rooted in Augustine back from the 300s and 400s in Catholic thinking, and then kind of is maintained by Calvin, right? Because Calvin believes that we are born totally depraved and born into sin, and so believed in baptism. But it is viewed in Catholicism probably more significantly than in Calvinism. That is, it's a sacrament. It is a means by which the grace of God is passed on. And so what happens is these Baptists, you think about 1607, 1609, and you think about what Seth taught on this past Wednesday night, about the Bible coming to them in their own language, and they're reading it, and they're reading like Acts 2, and they're hearing people say, men and brethren, what must we do? And they're like, wait a second. My baby never once asked me, men and brethren, what shall I do? They're reading about the call to repent and be baptized, or believe and be baptized, Mark 16:16, or whatever other text you're thinking of, and they're saying, wait a second, baptism is not for an infant. And so they begin to push for what becomes known as credo baptism or believer's baptism. A credo is like a creed that you believe in. So credo baptism, that's the technical term, I guess. Now, it is important to understand that they are not saying that baptism is for the remission of sins. And I can show you that more later. But I just want to say this. It is something to be noted, and I think noted in a good way, that there were people in the 1600s who, when they have the Bible in their own hands, are saying, wait a second, what you're teaching is not what it looks like in the New Testament. That's not what baptism looks like. So we will disagree on what the purposes are. I think that our conversation would have been a lot different with John Smith and Thomas Helwise than it would be with a modern Baptist potentially. But let me just say that the idea that they're saying we want to replant, we want to teach just what the apostles taught about baptism. So John Smith, for example, couldn't find anybody to baptize him, so he baptized himself. then he had questions about that, and he found some Mennonites who would baptize him. And so it's now I'll tell you this: like if I read my New Testament and saw that in order to be baptized, in order to have my sins washed away, I needed to be baptized. If I didn't have anybody else, I think I'd try to baptize myself, and I'd be praying the whole time that the Lord would take it. And then I'd be looking for who would baptize. I mean, I can see John. I can imagine myself being in that situation, saying, "What am I going to do?" So anyway, I think that's interesting. So you've got this rise of the Baptists who are challenging this doctrine. They also push against the hierarchy that had been created by the Roman Catholic Church, but then even by the Church of England. What they pushed for was basically congregational order. And that is not to say that they didn't believe in some kind of congregational cooperation, but that basically they would have taught that congregations stood on their own, that they were independent and autonomous. In fact, the Puritans who came over to the New World, they called themselves Congregationalists because they didn't believe in like a bishop or a cardinal or somebody having authority. They called themselves Congregationalists. So the Baptist Church today, Southern Baptist churches, which is the biggest denomination in the United States, I think it has more than 12 million members in Southern Baptist churches. Almost every Baptist church, unless it says otherwise, like in our area, would be a Southern Baptist church. There are Free Will and Primitive and Landmark Baptist and things like that, but almost all of them be Southern Baptist. Their Baptist faith and message says that there are two offices in the New Testament: overseer/pastor/elders, calls them that, and deacons, and that every congregation is independent and autonomous. Now, what has happened, and I'll talk more about this later, the Southern Baptist Convention, what it's an organizing group where all of these churches can send in funds, and then they establish, like they just had an election for a Southern Baptist church president who oversees, and then they've been working lately to identify which churches can be included in Southern Baptists and not, and we'll talk about that later. But this idea that they read the New Testament and they say, wait a second, when Paul makes his way back through the churches in Southern Galatia, he's not establishing, cardinals and archdioceses and all. He's establishing elders for them in every church. And that in 1 Peter, when Peter writes to them, he doesn't write as a pope. He writes as a fellow elder and as an apostle and says, let me encourage you to shepherd the flock of God which is among you. And so there are people reading their Bibles and they're seeing this. And so I'm not saying this to say, well, there's no differences. There absolutely are, and I think we need to highlight them. But when we're talking about the origins of this, like we can see why they're coming to some of those conclusions. Now, let me go back here one second. In North America, in what would become the United States, there was a man named Roger Williams. Roger Williams was in New England, in Massachusetts, and he began challenging Puritan leaders. He was eventually excommunicated, and in the 1630s, he was sent and he established Providence, Rhode Island, where he established the first American Baptist church. So you can see kind of the trend from Puritanism, and then he was kicked out of the Puritan churches in America and established the First Baptist Church in America. Okay, we'll say more about them in just a second. Now, when it comes to the origins of the Methodist churches, they're a little bit later, more like in the 1700s. And there's a couple of names that you might recognize: John and Charles Wesley. If you don't recognize them, just look at some of the songs in our book, and you will find their names pretty quickly and pretty frequently. I think it was Charles especially that was a prolific songwriter, and many of them are very, very good. Now, the Methodist, the name, you can see where the name for Baptist came from, right? They're wanting to baptize people. The Methodist name comes from these processes, these habits, these methods that they are trying to introduce that will help create sanctification or making holy. I think that what they are seeing, and if you were to read John and Charles Wesley's notes or read about them, I think you would find John and Charles Wesley looking at the world of the Church of England in the 1700s and saying there's a lot of people going to church and not a lot of people who've been born again. They would say there's a lot of people who are on the membership roll of the Church of England, but they're not passionate, they're not holy, they're not devoted. And so what they say is we need a new commitment to be committed to faithfulness and devotion. And they will use language talking about the new birth and being transformed from the inside out. And that's what these methods. So what they would do is they would meet together in these little groups. They did not, it seems to me that at the beginning, they did not intend to create new churches. They were creating like small group Bible studies. But what happened is what they were teaching and preaching and pushing was so out of step with what the Church of England was saying that in order to continue, they were going to have to create a new denomination. Now, all of that is to say is that one thing that is special or unique about the Methodists is that they were called Arminian. So I don't want to be a Calvinist or an Arminian, but I think most Methodists would embrace a description of Arminian. I really think that a lot of Baptist theology is Arminian, but I don't think many of them would commit to that description. So Arminius was actually a student of Calvinism who pushed back on some of the elements. And the key one that I think is the most helpful for us to understand is what's called prevenient grace, Prevenient. That would have been good to put on a PowerPoint slide, like something where everybody could see how it was written out. That would have been nice. Okay, prevenient grace. And that idea is the Methodist does not deny that like a child is born inheriting Adam's sin and guilt. But they believe in a universal measure of grace that God has given to everyone. So that rather, like the Calvinist says, you cannot respond unless God works on you. The Methodist would say that God has given everybody the little sliver of life that they need in order to be able to respond. Brother Ken, you probably know a lot more about Methodism than a lot of us, because in Fiji, where you've done a lot of work, it's like a third of the people are Methodist, right? It would be the dominant. I mean, Pentecostals would be a pretty high number, but yeah. So Brother Ken, he talked about it Sunday that he had helped start the work in Fiji, and that's the Methodists were very evangelistic, and I'll show you some more of that in just a bit. But this idea of Methodism is they would basically take a free will position, and they would basically say that it is your faith and your response to Christ that matter. And then they are pushing for a sanctification through your life where you are developing into holiness. I think when we follow the story, I think you'll see that there are some developments of this that develop like into a holiness group where they basically believe that they can come to a state of perfection. I don't know how John and Charles Wesley would have thought about that. But basically, there's this continual push for sanctification through these methods. Now, I say all of that to say this. There are things that I would disagree with them in 16 and 1700 about. There's certainly things I would disagree with the Baptists and Methodists in certainly today. But do you see why that's significant for what's happening in this era? Is when they are saying the New Testament doesn't say baptize babies. It says baptize people who are believers. That's noted. Right? When it says, hey, these churches are supposed to be organized on a congregational level, that's notable. When it says that we need to be working to be born again, and that we need to be changed, and that we need to be pursuing holiness, and that we need to not be devoted to, just the church roles and hierarchy and all of that. Okay, I think we see some significant things. Now, in the United States, you have two major periods of revival. The first one is called the First Great Awakening. They didn't call it the First Great Awakening. They didn't know there was going to be another one on this. So they just called it the Great Awakening. So in the 1730s and 40s, there were some preachers. The major names here, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield would be the major figures here. Jonathan Edwards, if you're reading from like a secular perspective, that many people would say he was the greatest American theologian ever born. He was a Calvinist, so I don't know. But maybe you've heard of his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That was what was called a Jeremiah sermon. So that comes from Jeremiah. And what kind of prophet was Jeremiah? This is not like it's supposed to be. God had given you all these blessings. He had given you all these favors, and you have completely turned away from Him, and destruction is coming. In his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards described people like a bug in a spider's web hanging over the pits of hell. Right? That's a Jeremiah. Right? It's dangerous. But then they would have other sermons that would be revival sermons. You don't have to be in that condition. You can be saved. Now, Jonathan Edwards was a through and through Calvinist, but you couldn't always, and this is the thing about Calvinists, isn't it? You can't always tell it in their preaching, right? When they preach, they're going to say, you've got to respond, you've got to obey, you've got to be faithful, you've got to have this reception of the Word of God. And so he would say, now, what happens in the 1730s and 40s in his little town in Northampton, Massachusetts, revivals spread. People are obeying the gospel. People are becoming church members. The movement is spreading. And what's happening is he writes this down, and what does he call his book? A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now, that's a catchy title, all right? Most people just call it Faithful Narrative, right? So this spread around to everybody. And they're reading this. They're just like, how can we recreate what's happening in Northampton? So they read his guide. So they start preaching their Jeremiah sermons, and they start preaching their revival sermons. And then this guy, George Whitefield, comes up the coast of the Americas, and he was the first British invasion, right? He had been a former actor and was a powerful speaker. He was cross-eyed, and he would look into people, and he was so motivating. He was so powerful that like even Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, right, didn't even believe in the new, contributed money because he thought that what Whitefield was doing was so valuable. Now, a lot of the established churches didn't like what was happening because a lot of this is kind of saying, listen, your preacher, if he's not really converted, he may be up there just reading a passage, but if he doesn't have the new birth, then he doesn't really have what he needs to be faithful. As far as this goes, this is a book. This is Thomas Kidd is a professor at Baylor. He is a Baptist, a Southern Baptist, and I find he's probably my favorite as far as secular historians looking at, when I say secular historians, he would identify as a Christian, but somebody writing from a historical point of view, he is very, very, very helpful. But this is America's Religious History. And he says that as a result of the Great Awakening, there were some people who wanted the revivals. There were some people who didn't like the revivals. Mostly a lot of the old Church of England people in Virginia don't love it. And then some people thought, well, if the Holy Spirit can dwell in anybody, if the Holy Spirit can speak through anybody, maybe that should overturn the social order. So there were some radical results. This is the birth of what we would think of as American evangelicalism. When I say evangelicalism, if you hear somebody talk about being born again or God working on their heart or, something like that, that's probably a result of evangelicalism. It just comes from the idea of gospel presentation. But it is a much more emotional, individual response than what you would have heard. Like you won't hear that kind of preaching, particularly in an Anglican church or even in a Roman Catholic church. Now, the Second Great Awakening is more significant with the growth of Baptists and Methodists. So there were multiple issues, and what they would host is they would host these camp meetings. The most famous ones were in Kentucky, Cane Ridge, Gaspar River. They would gather and they would have preachers from all different denominations standing up in these booths, and they would be preaching, and thousands of people would gather, and they would either be converted or they would be recommitted to Christianity as it was known. And what happens is this is the major explosion of Baptists and Methodists onto the American scene. And the reason for that is the Second Great Awakening takes place in the early 1800s. Cane Ridge was in 1801, and a lot of people note that as the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. And it was during that age. Just think about the world that they were living in. 1776, they fought a war for independence. All right? That every person made in the image of God, all created equal, endowed with life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And that the government exists to protect your rights. And as you go through the early 1800s, that more and more people are getting to vote for who their president's going to be. They're getting to make pretty big decisions. And more people are owning land and having real economic independence that people did not have back in England. It becomes a very democratic society. Not Democratic Party, right? Bill Clinton hadn't even been born yet in 1820. But this idea of every person has a say kind of thing. You can vote, you can own your land, you can make your own choices and decisions. If you don't like the choices and decisions that are being made in Virginia, you just move to Tennessee. You don't like the decisions there, you just move to Missouri. You just keep pushing westward, right? This very democratic moment. And Baptist and Methodist churches capitalize on that democratic movement. Let me explain. Baptist churches, basically anywhere where there are 2 or 3 people, they can establish a church. It's not how it works with Catholicism. It's not how it works with Anglicanism. If you're going to establish a new Catholic church, you have to have authorization from the Catholic Church itself. You have to have a blessing or an ordination so that you would be allowed to go and build a new Catholic church. That's why there is one in Franklin County. They're not going to have one on every street corner in a town like this, because they're going to have one that has been sanctioned by the Catholic Church official. The same thing is true with the Church of England. You don't have people, you can't have a priest who just goes out and says, today I'm going to establish a new church out here. It just doesn't happen. All right? It's not allowed to happen. But Baptist churches are not like that, which is why they are the way they are. And in the West, right, in the rural West in the 1800s, in the deep South in the 1800s, the Church of England was not interested in sending out people to establish churches in the rural areas. It just didn't make sense for them. When you can only have 10 or 15 people meet there, why would you? It doesn't make sense for the Catholic Church to be sending people out here. But what you do have is you have Baptist folks who move out to Kentucky or to Tennessee or to Mississippi, and they live in this little community, and they all meet and they establish a Baptist church. And the fact they don't have to have authorization from some centralized institution makes that easy. And almost all of the Baptist preachers in those early days were bivocational. They were a farmer, or they were a preacher, or they were a merchant, or whatever, and they would preach on Sunday. The Methodists took advantage of it in a different way. The Methodists developed circuit riding. So one Methodist preacher would serve multiple churches, maybe 4, maybe 8 churches. And he would ride around to those churches. So those congregations would meet every Sunday, and they would sing, and they would read, and they would pray. But the preacher would come, and he would check on them, and he would preach a sermon maybe once a month. Now, I know y'all really like the sound of that. You only have to hear from me like twice. Okay, when I'm teaching Bible class, you have to hear from me a lot. But anyway, but that idea is like now one preacher can serve a huge area. Right? And as a result of that, there was no limit to the number of churches you could establish, basically. Now, the Methodist Church, one thing that they did is they very often would take that circuit rider and they would move him from that circuit to a circuit across the country, because they didn't like the idea of multiple denominations being established. And they were afraid that if one guy got too much influence in one area, he could lead those churches in a different direction. All right. One other thing is the Methodists really picked up on this idea of speaking the language of the people, right? Not in speaking in a foreign language like the Roman Catholic Church did, or speaking in very high scholarly language like some of the Congregationalist churches did, but speaking the language of the people so they can understand. A great book on this. This is a secular book. Sometimes those are helpful in doing religious history because they don't have a bone to pick necessarily. They're not trying to make their case. But this book, Nathan Hatch, Democratization of American Christianity, I don't know what year it came out. 1989, year I was born. This is a great year. I was born and this book came out. That's wonderful. Okay, so this book basically makes the argument that the Baptists and the Methodists picked up on that democratic tone in America. Now, let me say this. This is a chart of denominational growth from 1780 to 1860. I don't know if you can see this, but the chart here goes up to 3,000, all right? So Catholic, Congregational, Episcopal, Lutheran, German, Reformed, Quaker. There's a lot of growth in all of those churches, right? Almost all of that growth from 1780 to 1860, almost all of that is proportional to immigration, right? People moving from other countries and establishing churches that are like they had back in Germany or like they had back in Italy or wherever they were. The Baptist and the Methodist churches, they go off the charts. You see that little break right there? It's because in the year 1860, there were 12,100 Baptist churches. There were 19,800 Methodist churches. Off the charts growth. Look at this. Can you see this on this chart? You see how many Methodist churches there were in America in 1780? Oh, that's right, there's 0. Right? How do you go from 0 in 1780 to 19,800 in 1860? Because they were passionate about evangelism. They were passionate about preaching the gospel, at least as they understood it. And they had a message that was not like the old Calvinist message. It was a message of God has given you the responsibility to respond. And people latched on to that. Now, of course, we're out of time tonight. But let me say, my goal tonight is not necessarily to answer all of the concerns that we would have about Baptist and Methodist doctrine. We will certainly talk about that. But what I want us to see is that the divisions that are created by Baptist and Methodist are at least in part of a desire to get closer to the truth. The problem is that they identify themselves not as being committed to Christ, but as the thing that they found that they thought made them special. You see what I'm saying? They became identified not as New Testament Christians, but as Baptists, because that was the thing. We do this better than everybody else. We do the baptizing right. The Methodists didn't say, we are disciples, we are seekers. They called themselves Methodists because they wanted to say, look at the programs. And maybe those were terms that were labeled by other people, but they left those terms instead of saying, we don't want to be identified by our Baptistness. We don't want, well, we'll say more about that later. Okay, we'll talk. Thank you. All right.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.